Sometimes, just a small act of kindness could open the door to an unimaginable horror. When a man extended a helping hand to a stranger, he never thought it would be the same person who'd later destroy his world. In this story, we rewind the clock to trace the disturbing path of William Pierce, Jr., a troubled man whose life of crime and brutality wreaked havoc across multiple states. From a heartbreaking confession to a string of ruthless murders, the story will leave you questioning the terrifying ripple effect of a single moment in time. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder. I told him to stop back when he got out if he needed anything. He stopped back. That heart-wrenching line came from a husband who'd never imagined that a small act of kindness to a stranger would end in devastation. Now, he's left feeling like that one moment changed everything for his family. To really get how this all went so wrong, we've got to rewind and start from the beginning. His name was William Pierce Jr., or Junior, as he liked to go by. He was born October 11th, 1931, in Midville, Georgia. Those of you that know your American history will know that the date that William came into the world, it was right in the middle of the Great Depression. He, like many other people during this challenging period of time, grew up hungry and in deep, deep poverty. Times were difficult, and many people suffered. Among those were William's parents, who often fought with each other, the loudest and most aggressive of which being his mother. She was a strict, opinionated woman, and after she divorced William's father, she took her frustrations out solely on her son. His mother ruled the household with an iron fist, and whenever she deemed that William was misbehaving, she would beat him without mercy. William grew into a severely psychologically damaged child, and that also reflected in his school life. He did poorly in his classes, and later a test discovered that he had an IQ of only 70. This would categorize him as mentally challenged by today's standards. William stayed in school until the 9th grade, and he dropped out and got a job as a road worker. He didn't last very long, however, and quickly quit to join the Army. That also only lasted a few months before William's mother submitted several presumably fraudulent doctor's certificates that claimed he was medically unfit for service. William was then discharged and sent right back to live with his domineering mother. By then, William was a bit older and had seen a tiny bit more of the world. He was still afraid of his mother and her beatings, but mixed in with that fear was also a hatred and disdain. William now believed that he was smarter than the woman who was dominating his life, although he wasn't quite brave enough to stand up to her just yet. To keep himself busy, William found work in a local car rental service. His colleagues seemed to like him well enough, but they also found him stiff and awkward, especially with the customers. Today, you might say that William was probably on the spectrum somewhere. Despite this social awkwardness, William did, however, find love, if only briefly. He got married and moved to Swainsboro, but his marriage only lasted 3 months before he and his wife divorced. He may not have been successful in romance, but the move did, at least, separate him from his mother. Now, with a fresh start, William found work at a furniture factory and began building a new life for himself. He did relatively well, but his new success, unfortunately, wasn't to last. Sometime when he was in his late 20s, William was involved in an accident at work that left him with a concussion. As we often see with severe head traumas, the accident changed him, and not for the better. William became more arrogant and outwardly aggressive towards others. Later in his life, there were people who believed that this change in behavior were the early warning signs of him developing a personality disorder of sorts. Now, with some sort of inflated ego and sense of self-worth, William was about to take his life in an entirely different direction. He began stealing and was caught a short time later. He was then sentenced to 5 years in prison. He managed to get out on parole early after serving nearly 3 years of his sentence, but only a few weeks after, and he was charged again. While out on parole, William robbed and then burned down a store. This time he was sentenced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. It was during a panel review for his parole that William's future hung in the balance. Before him laid a few more years in prison, and down a different path awaited freedom. Between them stood the parole board. He had years of good behavior and being a model inmate strengthening his case, but on the other hand, he had some pretty hefty opposition. The prison psychologist was there, arguing that William should stay in custody. He warned the board that William, quote, may be dangerous to himself and others, and that he was showing clear signs of mental illness. The board didn't listen, and they paroled William only 8 years into his 20-year sentence. This decision was one that they would soon regret. Later that year, in June 1970, William broke into a home in North Augusta, South Carolina. There he came upon 18-year-old Ann Goodwin, who was there babysitting her neighbor's children. William sexually assaulted Ann and then shot her. He raided the home, stealing several valuables before fleeing the scene and leaving Ann to her fate. She had survived the initial shooting, but would later, unfortunately, succumb to the wounds in the hospital. A few months later, 13-year-old Peg Coutinho left her family home in Sumter, South Carolina, to have lunch with her sister. 45 minutes passed when she didn't return home. Her parents knew something must be wrong. A statewide search ensued, fueled by the fact that Peg's father was a South Carolina state representative. Her body was recovered almost 2 weeks later, and an autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and then suffocated to death. Just 2 days after Peg's disappearance, William appeared in a service station in Vidalia, Georgia, about 3.5 hours away from Sumter by car. There he shot and killed 59-year-old station attendant Joe Fletcher. William then stole about $79 from the cash register before fleeing the scene. He did the same thing again only a few weeks later, where he shot and killed a store manager, Lacey Tigpin, and then he returned to a familiar place. While previously working on a prison road crew only 2 months before his parole, William went into a store in Appling County. The store belonged to Helen Wilcox, but her husband was there that day, and Homer Wilcox was feeling compassionate. Quote, he wanted some cigarettes, and I gave them to him. I wouldn't take his money. I said, no, sir, I want to give this to you. I gave him $1 out of the cash register, and I told him, I know it ain't much. I told him to stop back when he got out if he needed anything. He stopped back. This time he was met by Helen Wilcox, and Helen would have a very different experience with William than her husband had previously. William kidnapped her and took her out to the woods surrounding the city. There he sexually assaulted her before shooting and killing the 32-year-old woman. He then buried her in a shallow grave and fled. 6 days later, William was robbing another store in Baxley. This time he killed 60-year-old Vivian Miles and attacked her 5-year-old granddaughter. The child managed to survive the incident with a severe head injury, but it turned out that she wasn't the only witness to Vivian's murder. While fleeing the scene, William was interrupted by a truck driver named Joe Overstreet. William shot at Joe, but somehow missed, leaving behind a man who would later be able to define William Pierce's fate. Finally, 2 months after killing Vivian, William was arrested after robbing another gas station in Baxley. In police custody, he confessed to a total of 9 murders, including the kidnapping of 13-year-old Peg Coutinho. A whirlwind string of events would follow. Joe Overstreet was brought in and identified William as the man he had seen fleeing the scene of Helen Wilcox's murder. This corroborated William's earlier confession, and law enforcement had many reasons for waiting to prove that William had initially been telling them the truth. By then, he had recanted his confession, claiming that he'd been drunk during his interview with the police and he hadn't been read his Miranda rights. Authorities had an irate state representative breathing down their necks, and he wanted justice for the murder of his daughter. William would also retract his confession about killing Peg. He claimed that the detectives had coerced him into making it by beating and torturing him, a claim that was somewhat substantiated by a report that mentioned bruises and burns across William's body. There also seemed to be a cluster of burn marks near his genitals. Others would believe his claims and question the legitimacy of his initial confession, but the courts disagreed, He traveled around America, following the path of destruction and the life of crime that he had led since his early parole in 1970. Only this time he would be there to face the music. For every judge and jury in front of him, William was hit with another life sentence, officially sealing his fate. He would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. He died in prison in Jackson, Georgia in 2020 at the age of 88 after serving nearly 50 years in prison. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for taking the time to listen. If you're a brand new listener, subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. If you're an OG listener, keep doing what you're doing. I love you, because I know that you're sharing this podcast with your friends and family. I know that because I can see the numbers. They continue to grow. The show continues to grow, and it has to be because of you listening that have been listening for a while are telling people about the podcast, and I really do love you for that. If you have any questions about the podcast, anything you want to know about, you can go to 10minutemurder.com. All the answers are there, or there you can find my email address, which is joe@10minutemurder.com. And some of you have emailed me asking if I've seen the new Menendez Brothers series on Netflix, and if I have, what I think about it. And I can tell you, at the point I am right now, that recording this podcast, I haven't seen all of it, but I've seen a good chunk of it, and I'll tell you that it's okay. It's not bad. It's not great. It's not terrible. It's all right to me. But there is one part of it where I had to pause it and then do some research, because I was like, there's no way this is true. This just seems like it's just made up for dramatic reasons for this series. I looked it up, and it was absolutely true, and I'll tell you what it is. During the funeral scene, when the brothers are playing the Milli Vanilli song, I thought, this is so weird and strange and looks like it's made for TV. It wasn't. It's real. They weren't making that part up. But it's so strange that it feels like they have to be, but they're not. Anyway, I will finish watching the series at some point, but I'm not canceling appointments to go and watch the series. It's not that good. And that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder.